Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Tuesday, August 20th, 2013 meeting of the Urban Village Development Commission. Today we are going to continue on with the Swedish Development Agreement and discussion. I'd like to go ahead and start off the meeting, however, with three meetings worth of meeting minutes, and I want to make sure that everyone's had a chance to take a look at them. And I know we have a couple of comments on at least one of them, but let's start with the Tuesday, July 2nd meeting minutes. Are there any comments, questions, or edits? Everybody good? Okay. And Tuesday, July 16th, did we all get a chance to look at those? Any questions, edits? No?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, we have one. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff. I didn't know where we might say it or how it should be said, but I made a place marker on page 4 when it came to making the motion. And because we spent a lot of time talking about, and it's reflected in the minutes, the change to the status or the way that Lot 12 was dealt with, I wondered if the record should show that the motion included a change to the approach for Lot 12, the plaza. I know it wasn't like it was a motion that was changed, it was the motion, but the motion incorporated a resolution to much of the discussion that the minutes reflect. So I wanted to bring that up.
Okay. I think that's fine for the minutes to reflect it. I just wanted to let you know that the findings and conclusions include the full motion, including the edits to the condition, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be in the minutes as well.
No, that's fine. Yep. Okay, thank you. And anything else on the July 16th meeting? Okay, and let's move to the Tuesday, August 6th meeting minutes. Nina, I know you have some stuff there as well. Anybody else have anything? Yep, let's start with Michael. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know where this would go, but I just wanted to insert the question I did have about the build-out of the new property, if the old sustainability measures would be required in that, like the percentage of build-out. There's certain sustainability measures that are required of the property that's already in existence with Swedish. Will those count for the new property, or can they just build that without any of those sustainability measures?
Okay.
So I worded it better, I think, the first time. But
Okay. Okay. Anything else? Chantal?
I have a couple little changes. One is on top of page 4. It wasn't views, it was Muse. What is it? How do you say that? M-E-W-S?
Booner? No, Muse?
Muse, yeah.
Oh, Muse.
Right.
Muse.
Right. And on top, well, not completely the top of page 5, I don't want it to be worded in a way that sounds like I feel that 50% is too much. It's the opposite. So that I'm concerned about the gaps between the 50%, not the fact that 50% was too much.
Right, so the intent came out opposite of what you, right? Or the wording came out opposite of your intent.
So one way to correct that would be that that 50% would lead to too many gaps.
Okay. Nina? Yes.
I wasn't at the meeting. I missed it very much. But I listened to a portion of the first part. So these pertain to the opening of the meeting. And I had 3 things that I noticed in the videotape that did not make the minutes that I thought were significant enough to include. One was the answer that Keith Niven gave that of what our role is to make a recommendation for approval of the City Council. I thought that was worth clarifying. Also, that a development agreement is not required, that's not the only conclusion to these discussions. And that Chairman Walker asked for a description of the consequences if we don't have a development agreement.
Thank you. And what, you looking at me like that didn't happen?
I forgot it so clearly it didn't happen.
Yeah. And yeah, that's exactly right, Nina. And I was expecting that we are going to see that at some point. I didn't know when that would be, but
And you want that in writing and not just a
presentation.
verbal presentation by Swedish?
Which thing are you referring
I'm sorry, I'm referring to the third thing that I think.
What happens if there's no development agreement?
Right, what happens if there's no development agreement? And I don't think Nina's saying we need that in writing. I think she's
Oh.
saying that was not reflected in the minutes that
Okay.
that was
So
requested.
I think they did address it at the meeting.
I was kind of expecting more of a presentation response with I don't know how
Like a
detailed it
guillotine
is.
and,
Yeah,
and heads rolling.
exactly,
Yes, we
yeah.
can do that.
I was kind of thinking PowerPoint presentation with 2 or 3, solutions
All right,
or
we'll
whatever.
try and be clearer on that point.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe at the next meeting.
All right, thanks. Anything else, Nina? Anything else? No? Okay. So we have a motion to accept the meeting minutes as amended tonight? Sorry? You make the move? Okay. We have a motion. Do we have a second? All right. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Okay. All right, let's move on. Let's see. We're going to start with Appendix C tonight, but do you want to start with any sort of a presentation? Is the applicant?
2 sentences.
Okay. Let's start with Ms. Lohman. Thank you.
Good evening. Let's see. So, just as a little bit of a reminder of some of the things I said last time, we know that some of the section numbers and appendix numbers are wrong. If you have little edits, like punctuation or spelling or missing words, feel free to, if you want to make sure we know those, feel free to email them to us. We probably won't do that tonight. I'm going to give you kind of a little general introduction to each of the appendices we talk about this evening. We'll have a conversation. The applicant, Swedish, may join us. At the end of the section, if they haven't had a chance to talk, I will likely give them a chance to tell you if they have other things they'd like to add about that particular appendix.
I had a kind of procedural question about B. Is that too late, or do it later, or?
It's all done. No, of course, you can go ahead.
Just, I wondered, what was it, lighting was pulled out of the guidelines into its own tab, but parking and circulation and landscape and signs are listed in the guidelines and in their own tab, and so I didn't know if there was a reason behind that it just wasn't all in the tab and not in the guidelines.
So this is, just a structural debate.
Okay.
And for instance, if any of you have looked at the CIP, will see that they handled it a little differently. We put, except for lighting, we put all the guidelines into the guidelines chapter and all the standards in individual appendices.
Okay.
With Raleigh, and I can't now quite remember why, I think it was because, well, with Raleigh, we put the standards and the guidelines in the guidelines chapter, and I think it's because that was the first time that we tried to cover lighting, and we realized as we wrote it that it wasn't just guidelines, that a component of that was standards, but we just didn't put, we decided not to add a whole nother tab, because remember how difficult that was. With Lakeside, we just pulled it out into a separate appendix, keeping the guidelines and the standards together, partly because we thought it was confusing with standards in guidelines, and we thought it was important. Lighting, not that it doesn't impact the urban environment, it has a big impact, but we thought that those two in particular bundled really well together. So it's just a structural preference.
Okay. All right.
That's the short answer. Okay. So we're going to start with C.
And let me just remind the commission that even though we're going to be moving through these appendices, we can always go back to others. Just because we've been through one and we sort of closed the chapter doesn't mean it's closed. And then we'll always have public comment opportunities as well. So, okay.
So C is land use. This was a bit of a knitting together and was kind of very much a joint effort between the applicant and city staff. There Lakeside was probably the starting point, but because there's such a limited number of land uses, quite a bit of the appendix was stripped out. And then we looked at both Rowley for some of the urban uses, and then Tallis because it had some similarities and, for instance, in terms of height, and pulled those pieces together. So it's kind of a knitting together of all three. As I mentioned, it's a limited set of uses, so it's a relatively brief appendix. In general, just to highlight a couple of things, there are no setbacks required, which is pretty typical in an urban project. That doesn't mean that there won't be setbacks, just no setbacks are required. The max height is 85 feet, which is the same as all of the town center in Issaquah Highlands. With one exception, there is a limitation on the very southern portion of the hospital property. That was from the final plat, and the hospital building complies with that. So it's just carrying forward a final plat element into the development agreement, but it doesn't change what's already been built.
How tall is Swedish Hospital at its highest point?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. I believe, I'm going to guess it's 50 to 55 feet.
I'm looking to see if there's any sort of, I don't know.
I was going to say, in terms of the above sea level, where it talks about 515 feet above sea level, what are we talking about that's up there now? Like, I have
So the
no-
back part of the hospital towards the trail is, so, it's this angled line that goes between a low point and a high point, and the back part of the hospital touches that line. I'm sorry, that's not what you were asking.
Yeah, it's talking about
Okay.
building elevation of 515 feet above sea level. So I was just wondering, like, the current building,
Oh,
any
so I'm
idea
sorry.
what that is?
Let me try describing it this way. The reason that we did that instead of a height limit, I misunderstood, I apologize. The reason we did that is it didn't matter if the ground level changed, the building still had to be under that. So that's an absolute kind of like line in space. So if you have, an 85-foot height limit and you put in fill, your 85 feet goes up. In this case, your height limit's here and your ground goes up, and that height limit doesn't change. And the reason that was in place is that there were, in the environmental impact statement for Issaquah Highlands, there were certain view corridors and certain view descriptions, and that would preserve what you could and couldn't see from certain spots that had been identified in the EIS.
I guess what I was looking for is if it's if the maximum height is 515 feet above sea level, existing buildings, are those 300 feet above sea level already, or are they
What is the
400?
elevation, I guess?
What is it, what do those numbers look like?
So-
What's
so-
there now?
Hospital.
Just so I get an idea.
So it just applies to the hospital, and the
Okay.
hospital it's doing a line like this, so I don't know exactly what that number is. They provided us with a graphic, and the south end of the building touches that angled line. So it's the maximum height
Okay.
it can be with that restriction on it. I don't know what the number is.
So it couldn't have gone to 85 feet unless the ground was lowered.
Right.
Where the seas rise.
In that,
And the seas
in that
rise, yeah.
particular portion of the site.
But because the plane is angled, it could add Blakely potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the
But not-
plane
not-
doesn't go, if we look at
It
the,
only goes halfway through the site.
yeah, so it's just kind of like this portion back here is the area that it applies to, and it was this portion of the building that kissed the line. And so everything behind there where there's a restriction was lower than the line. I'm sorry, I would have to have a section to show you more specifically.
But what we're talking about here is blocks 30, 31, and 32. So those.
Which are, is this area down
Oh, it
here?
is that area. Okay. Okay. So I don't understand blocks 30, 31, and 32. I guess I don't know that I've seen a recent map, or have I?
So
It
in the
indicates
final
those.
plat, there are, so this is block 28, and so the blocks count around like this, and there were blocks that kind of came down like this. Are you looking for see if you have the final plat? So there were blocks that came down like this, and certain blocks had a restriction on them at the south end, and certain ones didn't.
Okay. You okay with that? Okay. All right.
So that's all by way of a cumbersome introduction that I have.
All right, so in terms of land uses, folks, what questions do we have? Just one question on setbacks for me. Same as in the current hospital setup, right?
Yes, and throughout the town center
Yep.
has no setback required.
Okay.
And the only change that we've been talking about with Swedish at this point in terms of land use is the possibility of adding, and I'm not sure I'm going to use the right terminology, so if I don't and you guys want to clarify, please do, like assisted living or care facility. So that is something that Swedish has expressed an interest in possibly doing in the donut hole, or maybe even west of the hospital. So we've talked about adding that to the list of land uses that are on page 2.
And there was actually one other one, which was a form of lodging that would allow something like a Ronald McDonald House, so something for patients' families.
So is there anything we need to know by adding those uses, if it drastically changes anything with respect to traffic patterns or any other impacts?
Mike, if you're going to talk, you have to come to the microphone.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to speak specifically on traffic patterns, but just in general, any impacts that we should be aware of by adding those uses.
Yeah, Mr. Walker, typically the kinds of, well, like a Ronald McDonald House, it's family members who have someone in the hospital. They're not making trips. They're there at the hospital at that facility to look after their family member for a retirement, not a retirement home, but for an assisted living facility or a memory care facility. Those residents typically are past the point where they're working and make trips in the morning, and when they go out for shopping, it's typically they're taken there with a bus. So traffic patterns are dramatically lower than a regular multifamily dwelling.
So it makes me think of Timber Ridge, and I'm trying to remember any discussions we had around Timber Ridge, if that use created any additional impacts that we need to be concerned about.
So if you remember, Timber Ridge is a combination of independent living, kind of assisted care and nursing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they, what we did was we converted office space to the residential to allow Timber Ridge to go in, and there was not a traffic bump for that.
Yeah, and again, it's not about traffic, I'm just saying in
Yeah.
general. So, but that would be the one that sort of sticks out for people, I guess, right?
So,
Okay.
ambulance trips are greater, and that's not going to be an issue in this location.
Any questions? Yes, Chantal.
So I don't know if this is the best time or under the parking section, but the parking section only talks of number of stalls and whatnot, but this talks about under allowed use surface parking. So is there any limit, in terms of square footage of, we always talk about Issaquah being, having such a high percent of parking lots, surface parking. Is there any limits on this, or is this, if they could just cover everything with, under this agreement with?
So so we also talked about on the last page of that appendix, it starts off the first under density, it starts off, there's no minimum or maximum floor area ratio. We actually talked about having a minimum FAR, which would, I think, address your point, Chantal. If there is a minimum FAR, then it could not all be surface parked.
Right.
So, and I think what we talked about was 0.75. Is that what you remember? Hopefully everybody remembers that. So that was what we talked about in terms of a minimum FAR, which would be consistent with what I think we did in the CIP core area.
But
So
then you said there isn't any.
I'm sorry?
There is no minimum requirement.
We will be putting a minimum in.
Oh, you will be putting.
So right now, the way this language says, right now, it says there is no minimum,
Right.
but as we talked about this internally, we agreed there should be a minimum, and we're going to go ahead and use the minimum core FAR from the CIP as a benchmark, which was 0.75.
Okay.
So that'll be in this appendix which I think addresses your concern, at least.
And just, maybe others would appreciate this too, but for me, what does that mean? 0.75 what?
Okay, so as you started asking a question, I thought we just used a term that most people won't know what it is. So an FAR of 1 so FAR is floor area ratio. So it's the ratio of the building area to the site area. So an FAR of 1 allows you to do 1 story over the whole building, or over the whole site, or 2 stories over half the site, or 4 stories over a quarter of the site. So it has to do with, sometimes they're maximum FARs and sometimes they're minimum FARs. Issaquah Highlands has a maximum of 1.5, and we aren't approaching that. So.
Thank you. So is there any opposition to adding those additional uses? I mean, they've explained that. I'm assuming they'll go in there. Okay. Anything else on, so we have no minimum lot size. The height we talked about. Any concerns on the height? So it is possible that some of these buildings will be taller than Swedish today as long as they don't hit that 515 number. But so far we're not hitting the maximum height limit on any of the properties as far as I can tell at Highlands. I don't know.
And just to be clear, there's I think the language needs to be clarified a little bit. Within section 3.1, it talks about freestanding retail, and the only thing that can be freestanding is a pharmacy. And so we're going to clarify that, and that's in their existing purchase and sale agreement with Port Blakely. So even though we list things like a lab or other things, the only thing that can be freestanding is the pharmacy. So everything else will be kind of combined in with the medical office building.
So a question on that. Pharmacies have drive-throughs often.
Yes?
So is that what? Some do. That's why I said often.
Yes.
Yeah. So if it's a freestanding pharmacy, it will likely have a drive-through.
Do you guys know?
What's that?
Probably not likely.
Like that.
So, and just to clarify, we have a pharmacy already in our main hospital, and so I'm not. It's not in our immediate plans to create another pharmacy right across the street.
So if one was created, though, and there was a drive-through, I'm not opposed to it. I'm not in favor. I'm just wondering what the impacts would be.
It could have a drive-through unless we were clear that we did not want that to happen.
And I think in the guidelines, I'd have to look it up, I think they're discouraged. And that they, have to be cited in a certain way.
So if that were to occur, then additional scrutiny would be on it, and you would have to, obviously make sure that it's going to work with the traffic patterns, with the parking, surface parking area, and so forth, right?
Right.
Okay. Yes, Chantal?
So, I'm not concerned about the height from the point of view of the Highlands, but is Mountain to Sound still active? They used to have some pretty strict guidelines. I don't know strict, but they used to have guidelines about what you could see from I-90, and that's obviously a prime spot when you drive east on I-90. So is there still any involvement there? And
Yes, we hear from them periodically. I think the view as you're driving east is not the one, that's not the section that they have concerns about. Issaquah is kind of the point at which they break from a very green mountains to sound character to a more urban mountain to sound character. And the views up to Swedish from as you're heading east are from that more urban portion, whereas as you're driving westbound, you see almost nothing. And that actually is, I think, part of where the thing that Stephanie had me feebly trying to describe, that's part of where I think that comes from.
okay,
I mean, not mountains to sound, but it's along the same kinds
right,
of concerns.
from the view from the
Right.
from down below.
Okay, this has been brought up before, but if you guys had a chance to look at the height exceptions, we make sure we've covered stuff in there. We don't have any questions on that. This has been hashed through a couple of different times in previous discussions, but
We went back
Well-
to the old definition since last time was a little bit hard.
I did have, I couldn't remember how we landed about what an art piece was. And that,
eye of the beholder.
yeah. And I just was trying to remember why I didn't have time to look it up and see where we went with that. It was the only one that got my eye.
Yeah, I mean, this one's for me, this is a hard one because, you know, it would be impossible to dictate exactly what this looks like, but it also seems that there's such an open-ended, you know, sort of aspect to this that you could have a 90-foot chimney, you know, which I don't know why you would, but there's nothing saying you couldn't, right?
Or large wind turbine.
Or wind turbine, or a piece of art that Nina likes, but none of us do. So I don't know. I'm not looking to open this can of worms. I just wanted to throw it out there that so far we haven't had any egregious, you know, sort of implementations. But you would love to see wind turbines? Great. But I do wonder, though, when these things
I was
do
just
come up,
thinking of that.
who does review them? I mean, is there a point where somebody says, okay, yeah, we said you can have a greenhouse out there, but, you know, this thing is, you know, much too large, or it's unsightly, or whatever. Could that occur? Would somebody be reviewing that and making a determination on that?
Sure. So, I mean, so first of all, not that it would necessarily work out this way, but the way Swedish is proposing there would be a site development permit because of the size of the buildings. You would likely see it, and we would expect that something like that would come up. And if it didn't come up and it came back to us and we had concerns, we might bring it back to you. Or we might say that this seems within the context of what we expected. I mean, you know, for instance, you know, all the rooftop stuff. I went and took a bunch of pictures, actually, to see that, and we can talk about that later. But, you know, we have various avenues depending on what our concern is, and we can bump things up if we feel like we need to have a bigger public discussion about it.
All right, thank you. Michael?
Thanks. I do have a little bit of a concern here with the wording on page 3 for height exceptions number 7 at the end there. It says signage may not be placed on roofing, rooftop, screening, architectural embellishments, etc. So I know a lot of commercial buildings do have that screening and the sign will be up there.
It cannot be up there.
So you're saying that there can be no branding above the surface level of the roof?
It could not be, it could be on the parapet wall.
That's what I'm getting at, because this kind of reads to me like you can't have that.
Not on the roof.
So, you know, you have the parapet, which is the face of, and I know you know this, but I'm going to say this for everybody else's benefit. So you have the face of the building and the roof, and you can have your sign on what is perceived as the wall.
Mm-hmm.
But if your screening's back here and it's really, really tall, you can't have it on the screen. That's part of the roof.
Okay, so we don't count the parapet as an architectural embellishment. What if we had I'm thinking of a building that has like a little gazebo that's built into the corner. I have a couple of those, and we have signing on them, and they stick well up above the parapet. So that might be in. I'm just.
You know, it's hard working through all of these verbally, and I'm not criticizing you. I just, you and I may picture something different. Safeway has kind of a lantern tower at the corner, and they have some signage, but, you know, the walls of that corner do go up higher.
Okay, so that's fine then, no?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's what I was just getting at.
Okay.
All right, any other questions or concern? Nina, looked like you were
She did.
really
Well,
rearing back there.
I was just, to use Safeway as an example, they're not reaching their height limitation and having an exception above it. And so I think that Michael's concerns are there's no limitation to the exceptions. And I think that's what you may have been hinting at earlier. Sure, there may be some exceptions, but is there any control? on the height of the exceptions or any recourse when you say, well, you have this height restriction except for all these things. And if you said, well, I'd like to elevate that, they'd say, yeah, well, don't take my time for it because we have an exception here and it's allowed. So I wonder,
yeah.
is that what you're bringing up?
It
Do we
is.
need a little more
And-
structure there so that you do have the authority to
Well,
have it reviewed?
we've been through that, and I don't think we came to the ability to have that authority, or not the authority, but be able to put the guideline. So the answers that I got to the questions you just put out were, no, there's no limitation, but yes, there is recourse. When it does come to them, they can actually either veto it or change it or, work through it, correct? Did I articulate that properly? Okay. So I'm, as comfortable as I can be with that, because I think it would be impossible to say, okay, water tanks have to be this size, chimneys need to be that size, art pieces need to be pretty, that sort of thing. Okay. All right, anything else on this section, on this appendix? Okay. All right. Move on to
Processing. Permitting.
processing.
So this is, the appendix that we started with was Lakeside. It was the newest one. There were some changes in section 2.0. The city has embarked on, as part of the reorganization and effort of the city, we are trying to streamline and improve our processes, and there was what is called a lean workshop or Kaizen event, if you know that from the Toyota model. And that we are merging the urban village and the city processes, and so the edits here reflect that sort of unified city process, so that everyone's, in terms of how big permits are processed, it's the same, because it's very challenging for staff to have two different processes operating at the same time. I don't feel that it's a significant change, but it was to reflect that approach.
Stephanie.
So yet on the top of page 2, it says those are optional meetings. It says
Yeah,
they're make everything more efficient, but they're optional.
So I caught that,
Okay.
circled that, and that will be removed in the next draft, because they aren't optional. You're right.
So my question is, how so far the changes? Well, obviously Lakeside hasn't really done that much, right? But has anything sort of come to fruition? Are you seeing any positive response or?
From that new process?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I mean, not in, Lakeside had already pretty much gone through, but there are two city projects that we're working on, and in describing the new process to the applicants, they were both, I mean, it's very similar to what we did in the MDRT with some tweaks to recognize some different needs of non-master developer communities or builders. And they were both very happy with the description of it and how it would lay out. So I think we feel it's going to be good.
And this new process, these new processes will sort of, you think, stand the test of time with respect to how, staff may be structured over time with new leadership and that sort of thing. It will.
Well,
Obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but
well, we're captioning in the development agreements, that is both parties have to agree to a change there. But, we are getting positive feedback, and I don't, as I said, it's a more structured description of what the MDRT was already doing. And, we had, I think, success with that with a lot of different applicants over the years. So I think that increased the comfort level of the city, because this wasn't just made up from scratch.
Okay. And then the other question I have, just 2.4 commission. I mean, obviously today that's the UVDC, but if UVDC gets combined with another or is disbanded because of Carl's dealings or whatever, that something like this will still occur for the duration of the agreement, correct?
Yes, and I mean, the city has a development commission as well. So the city needs one. It has the same reference in the central Issaquah plan. All the development agreements refer to a commission. So there's going to be some kind of development commission that exists, whether there's several or one.
Okay.
Do you want to, there's one other change?
Well, one other kind of sizable change. So,
Yeah.
sections, let's see, so 2.8, or it actually says, it's 2.8, but then it's 2.7 and 2.7.1.1, talks about critical area studies. There are no critical areas on the property, so it seemed like we should just delete these, and we're not deleting them because they're unimportant, we're deleting them because they're not going to apply. So those, and then in the table on the following page, there's a critical area studies line, so we're going to take that out. So when you guys see the next red line version, those will be gone.
So this,
And there are a couple of changes to that table in 2.9 and Exhibit L1 noticing that are things that we've learned from, that weren't as clear as we would like. And so those edits will show up in the next draft you get.
so this is my naivete here, but could there ever be a chance where a critical area
Appears?
should appear or come to fruition, once something happens? And if that's the case, I might have a preference to keep it in, but maybe state, at the writing of this development agreement, there are no critical studies or critical areas identified, but should any become identified, then we will follow this procedure.
So if there's anything that is not in here, we revert to city code. So it's not that there wouldn't be critical area studies. We would just use the city's regulations for critical areas and critical area studies if we found a critical area we were unaware of.
Okay, and since I don't know the details about that versus this, is there some benefit to just reverting back to the city and not having this in here, or some benefit to keeping this in here for consistency with other development agreements of the like?
I would say that our preference is to be consistent with the updated city critical areas ordinance.
So revert to whatever the city's is at the time. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Nina? Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I have a follow-up question for you. When you gave a description of the appendix and how the processes at the city are changing and becoming modeled after those which we have in the development agreements, this is an isolated part of the development agreement, and I qualify my question that way. But when we're looking at, well, what would happen if we didn't have a development agreement? Then might you say that processing of permits would not be so greatly affected because the city is already streamlining processing in its standard approach to permit processing?
So are you thinking, for instance, when Issaquah Highlands or some other development agreement expires?
Yeah, say that the Issaquah Highlands Development Agreement was not replaced and this development agreement was not ratified, would processing of permits be one of the things that would not be so adversely affected by not having a development agreement? Too many knots, I realize.
Although often I answer immediately, I was actually thinking through your question. I do think there are things that are generally similar. I think one of the differences that the commission would appreciate, though, that's different between the city and the urban villages is the Architectural Review Committee. So in the city, the architectural review is by staff or commission. In the urban villages, it is by the Architectural Review Committee. My preference is the Architectural Review Committee. I could, and if you want me to, I will. But since that's the nature of the beast, I thought I wouldn't go into a lot of detail.
And I just wanted to kind of isolate this. I know I'm taking it out of context, but just as an example, if we're looking at what are our choices here, it is, I think, pertinent to bring up that the city, since the first time we did development agreements, is changing its permit processing, and that would have been a really important thing for a developer to want from a development agreement is a speedier permit processing.
I will say that one thing that's distinct, for instance, is timelines. timelines are shorter in this development agreement than they are in the city.
So Lucy, just one of the points, Nina, I think, because I want you to not lose this piece, because I think it's important, is the development agreement is a contract with the property owner in the city, and it is, the purpose of it is to give predictability for them long-term so that they decide to make the investment in the property. If the city changes its rules down the road and makes it more beneficial outside of the development agreement, they can always ask to adopt those subsequently approved procedures, and the city can choose to say no, or, I mean, likely we embrace them, which is why we adopted them for the rest of the city, so we would probably say, yeah, why don't you do that too, because it's good. But it could go the other way. The city could change its rules and make it more, you know, methodic. Sorry, I don't know what word I want. You know, and that could happen too with a different council and a different, you know, mayor's office, you know, and they would have the surety to know that if the city goes the other direction, that they can at least count on this. This may not be perfect, but it's something that they can make a decision on. So that's a piece that's, I think, important.
And the way I describe that is that changes in the development agreement are bilateral. Both parties have to agree. Changes in the city, while there's advertising and public hearings and stuff, they are more unilateral.
I appreciate that. I think you've clarified it for me. Thank you.
So that opens the next little window of maybe things that you guys will have interest in, which I skipped over and Lucy reminded me. 2.3 Architecture Review Committee. So Lucy lifted the language from Lakeside, and you remember as we talked this through at Lakeside and you guys talked about the composition of the Highlands ARC, we kind of we batted it around back and forth and came to an ending spot where the mayor would appoint one person to serve as kind of a checks and balance on the Lakeside ARC. And we did that. We have a lawyer on the Lakeside ARC. And so this language here is the Lakeside language. Now, I guess what I would ask you guys to think about is, I actually struck that out because Issaquah Highlands right now is all the buildings are reviewed by the Issaquah Highlands ARC. And, you know, it didn't make sense to me that we would create kind of a parallel Issaquah Highlands ARC that would have somebody appointed by the mayor just to review the buildings that are on the donut hole. And it just, even though I still understand the concern you guys have about the membership in the Highlands ARC, it didn't make sense for me to have like, you know, a pinch hitter sit in on those ARC meetings just when they do the Swedish project. It just seemed like a weird administration and makeup for the ARC to sometimes have a guest player on. And so, you know, even though this is kind of where this landed last time, I thought we should strike it out and just say it's going to be reviewed by the Highlands ARC. But that's, you know, teeing this up for you guys to, I think, talk it through, because I know you have real positions on this.
Well, my preference would be to go the other way and put the rules into the Highlands, but obviously we can't do that. So I understand what you're saying here, and I actually don't think it's an issue. I agree that you wouldn't want to necessarily throw somebody in there just for this piece. I'm also not concerned, at least today, that this will. I mean, Lakeside was a whole new thing with a bunch of different types of housing types and buildings and neighborhoods and that sort of thing, and I think that's a very different situation here. So I would be comfortable with your proposal there. At this point, I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it'd be odd to have someone come into the other ARC without context. I'm not sure how you pull it off otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Any concerns? Any questions on that?
Well, you guys can mull it over.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll have time to talk about this
Yeah,
again.
so I mean, I think right now, I think that's a reasonable thing. So what we're saying here is it's not crossed out on our version, right?
But
It's
the
something
next
you've
one
crossed out.
the next one you'll get, it'll be gone.
Okay.
It'll be redlined.
So it's just the one representative appointed by the mayor that would come out of there?
Right.
Yeah.
And one representative to the,
Okay.
and then to that comma.
Okay.
Okay.
Anything else on this one? Don't tell? Stephanie, anyone? No? Okay.
Ready to move to circulation?
Yeah, I think we can move to circulation. Appendix E.
So Appendix E is circulation. We again started with Lakeside because it was the newest one. Like Lakeside and unlike Raleigh, the circulation, in Raleigh we did very simple street standards and put a lot of the descriptive language of the various circulation facilities into the guidelines. We decided with Lakeside we wanted to integrate that. So all the description of specific facilities is integrated into a single chapter here. There is, you may have noticed that the master circulation concept, there isn't one. Like in Lakeside, there was a specific plan for PEDs, bikes, and vehicles. We didn't do that partly because you have some existing streets which set a framework, and partly because in doing the master site plan, we will have an opportunity to talk through that with them and develop that. So one of the things that is different than Lakeside is we added existing streets and provided the non-residential street standard, which is what the type of streets and the standard to which 7th, 8th, and Blakely were built to. And although you don't see it right now, we've been sort of developing a Skybridge piece that will be you'll see it in the next draft. Let's just leave it at that.
All right, it goes between the current hospital and whatever buildings are going to the north of that?
Right, so you'd like a preview.
No, that's okay.
No, I'm happy to give you one, Jeff. I'm just teasing you. What we're saying in the circulation section is that a sky bridge crossing Blakely from the existing building to a building on the north is, and I haven't heard their comments yet, I just sent this out today, so, is just granted, assuming it meets all the regulations and guidelines. Other sky bridges on over other streets or within the central block would be reviewed in the context of the overall master plan. And there's language about, trying to maintain a ped-oriented site, and there's lots of guidelines and standards that go with it.
So my question on that, I guess, without having it in here is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but most of the circulation stuff, or maybe all of it, is for public circulation, or at least, maybe on private streets even, but I would think a sky bridge is just, it's not like anybody can just go up there and cross over and go to that other building necessarily. I don't know if it's going to be a sky bridge that's going to be private use or restricted use or whatever.
So because we haven't had a chance to discuss that with Swedish, let me just say that is something that that's part of this, and I would like to have that conversation with them before we have the conversation with you.
It occurred to me that
Yeah.
it doesn't
No, I mean,
belong here or somewhere else because
absolutely.
of that reason.
It's something that you have to be clear about one way or the other, and I think we need to have that conversation with them, and then we'll have the conversation with you.
Okay, thank you.
Not
Stephanie.
to get caught up on language, but when I look through this, what I mentioned earlier is we have the whole guidelines section, and then we go here and we have more guidelines, and then we have requirements, and we have standards, and
Where are their guidelines in here?
it says one, purpose, intent, and guidelines.
Oh, yeah, I don't know why that's there.
Oh,
That should
okay.
be removed.
But I'm just, the difference between requirements and standards and guidelines, they all kind of start to sound the same thing to me. I know it'll be specific, like the requirements for this specifically would be listed, I would think, in this section as opposed to the overall guidelines. But guidelines and standards, aren't those kind of that?
So here's like Lucy's 2-second answer to the difference between standards and guidelines. So a standard would be that something has to be 5 feet. Mm-hmm. It's relatively straightforward and clear cut. A guideline is it has to be pedestrian oriented, and here are ways that you can do that. So the objective is fixed, pedestrian-friendly.
Okay.
The methods are, there are many methods to make something pedestrian-friendly.
Okay.
The section that you're pointing to, section 1.0, where it lays out purpose, intent, and not guidelines.
No guidelines, okay.
A lot of that's really useful to staff because, for instance, when they do modifications, when they're asking if they can change the rules, we're going to come back and say, this is the purpose and intent of these standards. Is the change they're proposing consistent with the criteria listed at the end of this appendix and this purpose and intent listed at the beginning?
Okay.
So it does read kind of like goals and guidelines, that particular section,
Okay.
but that's why that's there.
Okay, yeah, I was just getting, when you go into these sections, and then it's like, okay, I better go see what it says in B, and make sure there's areas where they overlap, and that's why
Right.
I was questioning why they weren't just all in their own chapter.
Right.
But, okay.
And, I think what we've found is having all the guidelines in one chapter, because a lot of them, it's not clear sometimes whether something is circulation or building, so that's why we've found it easier to have it all in one chapter.
Would it help, and maybe this is overkill, but to put in the definition section, guidelines versus standards versus whatever I don't know if we need to do that, but
My preference would be not to do that, but if you see some value in it.
I don't necessarily. I just threw that out there just in case, if this comes up with another commission or people on the commission that weren't here to have this conversation, because I mean, how many of us have been at work and you're doing a review and what's your goal?
Yeah.
And people can't decide what a goal versus an objective is, right? So I don't know. Maybe it makes sense. So why don't you think about that, and if it makes sense to put it in.
And one thing I might suggest is, and we'll think about it, and you might go back with this in mind and look at the introduction to Appendix B, which talks a little bit how guidelines rest between goals and standards. It doesn't really say exactly what a standard is. It says more about how we use the guidelines and what their purpose is, and see if that helps too. But we'll think about it as well.
I guess I was just looking at it more of like, I don't want one section contradicting what the other section is saying and trying
Right.
to kind of compare them, so.
Understood. Chantal, I think you had something? No, you don't. Okay, Nina.
I wanted to ask a question about bicycles, and it seems like there aren't, I understand that there might be bike lanes, but there probably won't. It's a very low speed limit, and that there are 25 mile an hour and lower streets, and then there are trails. And what I wanted to ask about was signage that might assist in the accessibility of bicycles, whether it's sharrows or cars share the road with bicycles. I'm thinking about these certain kinds of signs that I see around, and then the other one might be on a paved trail that pedestrians have the right of way over bicycles, for instance. So say those three types of sign types. Who would be responsible for putting those in, and should that be noted in the signage requirements?
So if you look on page 5 of the circulation, so this is a question for you, Nina, if this addresses it. Y, which says signage, provide signage or other indicators for users' navigation, wayfinding, safety where appropriate. So that would be sort of our basis for asking for signs, and our expectation is that during their land use permit and then their construction permit, that the signs that are necessary for wayfinding and safety would be provided as part of their project. Doesn't mean the city might not realize at some point they had to provide additional ones, but the goal is to have it as part of the original development.
I see what you're saying, and that's where I was heading to, was to that paragraph. But I wondered how, to what reference does that make of an inventory of things that, what is appropriate and what is required? Is there a city definition that comes into play at that time? Where do you go? I mean, do they say, hey, well, this sign, do you say, hey, sharrows are appropriate, and the developer says, well, hey, I don't think that's appropriate, and then
We arm wrestle.
Then we arm wrestle.
Well, but it's not entire, I would say it's not, because, for instance, with the existing streets, we would be working with the Public Works Engineering Department and/or Public Works Operations based on on how they're handling it citywide. And now Keith will say what he would like to say.
So I think, the thing about that, Nina, is, if you have a bike plan for your community, then you know where you've kind of designated the bike routes. And if there happens to be adequate room for bike lanes or multi-use trails, then you probably opt for those. If there's not enough room for those, then you go to Sharrows, and, even down farther on the list is just nothing. So what I would say is, through this property, I assume that this will be covered by the city's bike and ped plan that it's working on for completion by the end of the year. Because as
The city's doing a master bike and pedestrian plan.
out of the Office of Sustainability, and I assume it's going to include Issaquah Highlands because that's part of the city, last I checked. And what I would say is, through this neighborhood, we have the separate multi-use trails, but we also have plat conditions from the West 45 that talks about non-vehicular access pretty specifically through this block. And so I think you are starting to create the expectation that there are routes, and how those routes are handled. I don't think we know yet because we don't have the site plan for their property. That'll come in hopefully in the next year or so. And so, if they choose to push it to the perimeter streets, then I think we can have this conversation about, okay, well, if that is the designated, like, say, east-west bike route is now either on Discovery or Blakely and not kind of through the middle of the block, which would have a very different character associated with it, what form does it take? Well, on Blakely, there's no room other than in lane. So then you could start to have that conversation about, well, is it safe in lane, or do you want some signage, or what is the case? But because we don't know how that is going to resolve itself yet, I think that's a little bit of a premature conversation. I don't mean to put you off, but I think it really wants to happen with the site plan for the donut hole.
I'm tracking with you there, and what I think might be the opportunity is that because we are developing these two things at the same time, possible development agreement for the property and the bike plan, what you'd said earlier in the meeting about if there is no definition in the development agreement, then the standard is taken up by the city code and it would be taken up by the bike plan. So then what I might be looking for is the kind of language in here that does not exclude this property from the bike plan, something that takes this. I'd rather that it didn't have something in here so that the bike plan would be the standard. So if you guys can help me find a way for that, I appreciate that.
We'll talk, let us talk about that. I
Pull that
think we
over.
need to find out the status of the master.
Anybody? Scott?
Couple quick questions. On page 5, item number V, V as in Victor, sidewalks minimum width has been stricken. Just curious if that is a non-qualifier. Is that why it was removed?
No, so it's the way it did it. If you look at the very tail end of that, it says 6 feet. It does it automatically, and it doesn't put it necessarily where I would choose to put it, which would have been up front, so it's a little more obvious.
So that's part of our lean training. We took out all those words and just put 6 feet.
Did you catch it? Right. Okay, perfect. Next question would be item number X, or item X, site distance vehicular. And my question being, as it's written here, site distance is not regulated for private roads and controlled intersections. Are we defining this development as, or incorporating private roads? Is that a qualifier?
I don't know what you mean by incorporating private roads. Do you mean, could there be private roads in
Could there be
this?
private roads associated within this development?
Yes.
Okay.
And what that doesn't mean, it means it's at their choice whether they choose to use site distance or not.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that they,
Okay. Do we feel that we should have a guideline or requirement? I would feel pretty strongly that site distance is an important feature.
right,
the
and
sake
if
of
it is an
visibility.
important feature to them, it will happen. But there might be some advantage to them to not have it. now, in the face you're making is the one their engineer will probably make and will recommend that they do something different.
Okay.
But because it's a private road, we're leaving it in their discretion. It doesn't mean that it won't happen. It just gives them more flexibility on private roads.
Okay.
Are you tagging on? I don't know if Scott was done.
I was actually tagging on, but.
Oh, okay.
If he's not, then go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Chuck.
I was just gonna say, when a private road intersects a public road, how does that work?
It would be enforced, my
Thank you,
puppet master is telling me that it would be enforced as a public road.
thank you.
Michael?
Thanks. I have a kind of silly question. Are these lights phased for emergency vehicles up here? Are they overridden by emergency vehicles to let crosswalks stop and lights turn green? They are.
The ventriloquist says yes.
Is that, I don't see anything in here about that. Is that just, where does that really apply and say that has to?
So that's a level of operational, that is a technical piece that
Okay.
would be dealt with at a technical level and not in the development agreement.
So even though, like Appendix S or whatever S here says, pedestrians have priority, pedestrian routes maintain a direct route, that even though we're going to plan for that, emergency vehicles will always have priority and right of way.
I can't say they will always have that. That would be a public works engineering decision in consultation with Swedish as an essential facility. I can't imagine why it would change, but I don't think it's in your and my purview to set that up permanently, where it would not be a discussion between the engineering and operations department and Swedish based on the latest technology, for instance.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yes. Anything else? I just have a quick question. I don't know what exhibits D1, 2, 3, and 4 were. They're deleted on page 17. Obviously, they probably don't belong there anymore.
Those were the circulation plans for bikes, peds, and vehicles.
Okay, thank you. All right, anything else on circulation? All right, let's flow out of this one to utilities.
So, in the Issaquah Highlands Development Agreement, there were 3 appendices: stormwater and groundwater was one, potable water and sewer. Our approach in the more recent development agreements is to combine them into a single chapter. And a big part of this was to update the various utilities to current code. In particular, stormwater, the current state and federal regulations do not allow development agreements to vest stormwater. And so those regulations, predominantly this is saying that this will all, it either says or explains how it will comply with the current codes.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks, Lucy. In the appendix, it has the language that you talked about, but what I wondered about was back in the opening, under recitals, in the original document. And
In the main body kind of
the main
contract
body,
part? Okay.
Yeah, and I was on page 10, and I'm hoping that that's the page that has 19.0, city processing and review, SEPA compliance. Am I on the right page? Okay, so in here, it looked like it's referring to the Issaquah Highlands Development Agreement in regards to these sort of things, when I thought it was supposed to be updated to newer standards. So it didn't seem like that matched with what was in 4.0 under stormwater.
So this section is going to, we had our SEPA responsible official look at this, and the language is likely to be revised, but to some extent the environmental reviews, such as the Issaquah Highlands EIS and other environmental reviews that have taken place, covered the environmental piece. That doesn't mean that we're keeping the Issaquah Highlands standards. It's just for the SEPA review.
So we'll double check that, Nina, for clarity. The intent here is that, you know, water and sewer are going to be, basically the facilities are in place, you know, the reservoirs are big enough, the sewer lines are generally big enough. If there needs to be any improvements done, the developer will need to do those. So stormwater is the big thing that's different, and that's because the regulations keep changing. It's not that they've just changed a lot since '95, they just keep changing. And so what this language is going to say is basically they're going to have to meet the current stormwater regulations that are in place with the city. So water and sewer are the same. Stormwater is going to have to meet current regulations. And, you know, what we talked about is, like, for example, monitoring was in here. And we actually went to the infrastructure committee last night and talked about stormwater. And one of the things that we don't know is about monitoring. If their stormwater goes into basically the Issaquah Highlands, mixes in with the Issaquah Highlands stormwater, that goes into the LRIG, and we're monitoring that, so there's no need for them to monitor that. If, on the other hand, they want to put their water into the whirlpool, which goes to Camp Creek, it may very well be that they would need to monitor that for maybe a couple years so that we make sure there wasn't any unanticipated things happening. So that would happen, though, with the drainage report that they would do when they submit their plan.
Did
Road
you use
route.
enough code terms?
Yeah, he's really throwing me off now. So I guess that much to say that I'm not quite following enough to feel confident that we're covering it here. Don't know if I could, but it just still does seem conflicting to say that what seems to be the kind of analyses that you would do on embarking on this was done back in 1996, and yet the standards are up to date with the current requirements. And one thing
It's not using the standards from 1996? It's
no,
used.
it's using the evaluation and analysis in a SEPA and the MDNS from then.
No, there'll be a new SEPA checklist submitted for this
Okay.
project.
Okay. Does it say that?
Keep going, something
Okay.
like that.
Go, I'll be reading again.
It will in the last appendix, which you don't have.
The puppet master will speak.
Yes, thank you.
And I don't know if this is actually your point, Nina, or even the question, but it's not automatically inconsistent to have an impact analyzed and addressed in a previous SEPA, but then use the current code to comply. An example of that would be that you need to accommodate so many trips. That would be a SEPA issue, and so you need to build a road. The code implication would be that you use a red stripe on the road instead of a yellow stripe on the road. So the current code may be dealing with a level of detail that is not addressed in the SEPA, and so they're not automatically in conflict.
Carl?
So Keith went exactly where I was going to go on page 4.6, monitoring.
Yes.
So does that need to be amended based on what you just said? Because it
So
sounds like the monitoring question is open-ended right now.
So we don't know right now, and I think we don't know because they don't have a stormwater plan designed yet. They'll do that with their first permit. And so this section, 4.6, will just be deleted. It doesn't need to be in the development agreement. It'll be part of the permit review when they come in with their stormwater plans.
Okay, Nina, did you have something else? Doing some more homework, okay. Anyone else on utilities? You know, so there were some questions that came from a letter from Connie that relate to this, and I know we addressed some of them to some degree just now, but Dan, did you want to expand on that, on Connie's letter and how those sorts of things are being addressed in general?
I'll be very general, and if you have something specific, please follow up. But
Thank you.
I think all of the points in Connie's letter are valid, and they're in fact on my same list, but those are SEPA checklist issues, and we don't have the SEPA checklist yet. So we have a placeholder to check all of those items as well and make sure that they've been analyzed and addressed and then mitigated, and that would happen in the SEPA checklist process, not as part of the development agreement.
Great. So, thank you, Dan. So I've said this before that, SEPA is something that is way over my head, or, it's not something I should be discussing, and I think it's such a, obviously such a technical process that it's really not within our purview to get into the details of that. What I do think we have the responsibility to do is to make sure that we ask the right questions, that the SEPA review is occurring, that whatever happens, it's getting addressed and dealt with and so forth. And if we aren't comfortable, because this is not something that we, at least I and most of us don't deal with on a regular basis, that when and if we get to a point of recommendation, we can certainly, and this is true whether it's SEPA or anything else, if we don't feel like we've adequately addressed it because of our, our level of knowledge and so forth, or lack of information in some cases, that we can move forward potentially with a, if and when we recommend, stating that this might, this is sort of out of our recommendation because we did not go through that level of detail. So I just want to make that clear. I don't care if it's SEPA or something else. If we feel like we get through all this stuff and there's something we can't answer because of real technical issues or additional reports and so forth that have to be processed or whatever it is, we can still move forward with stuff should we decide to do that and just leave that piece out of it or make note of it at least. Okay? All right. Yes.
I'm trying to keep up with Keith and go back and read and do it again. And I want to, first of all, acknowledge what you just said, Jeff, in that our work is to provide a recommendation to the City Council, and it can be in some detail that helps them know what we had confidence in and what we didn't. So I appreciate that. So Keith and Lucy, back to the main body and the SEPA compliance, the City Processing and Review 19.2. So if what Dan had said and what you have said is that there is a new SEPA checklist, am I understanding this correctly? And bear with me and help me through this. If 19.2.1 says that the parties acknowledge that it has been addressed and analyzed in prior environmental documents, including but not limited to the Issaquah Highlands Development Agreement, SEPA, and then it leaves a little blank there to be defined. And then later on it says that the city, in 19.2.3, the city may, pursuant to the procedures and standards, blah, 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 require an EIS, a supplemental EIS. If we've already made some moves towards what we think is required, like a SEPA checklist, should this part of the document say,
this is out in front. So typically what happens is we do the environmental review, and then I'd like to say typically, I think we usually do it this way, which causes you some consternation every time. The environmental review needs to be done before the development agreement is done. Okay? So ideally, we would have had the SEPA submitted, whatever SEPA decision would have been issued, and then this text would have been drafted based on that. So your question about, do we need to change this text? No, because this text will stand once the SEPA decision, which we're still hoping to work on and get done. I mean, at some point, this train may need to stop and wait for the other one to catch up. Because it's, at some point, the decision on the environmental review for this development agreement should inform some of the details of this development agreement. So at some point, we're going to need to kind of stop this train if the SEPA piece isn't done, because that needs to be done before all of this can get wrapped up. So I think this text is right. I think it's just relying on a SEPA decision that hasn't happened yet, but that we are expecting will be in process and happen sometime shortly.
Just to put a bow on this and move on, if the text here can show clearly that, instead of just a an arbitrary blank, a blank that says what is going to be filled in, and something that's just a little clearer to say what we're waiting for. And
So we don't even have a SEPA number that we could put in yet.
Well, and I think the reason that blank's there is because the drafter didn't have a list of all the environmental documents and technical studies that needed to be listed there. So that needs to be completed.
So we've got work to do here, Nina. Sorry.
Right. But in a nutshell, we're not going to just gloss over it and say, oh, we expect it to happen and move on. At this point, we will move on, but we will come back and address it. Okay. Thank you. All right. Any other questions or comments on this section? No? Okay, so it's about 8:17, 8:18. I'd like to move to Appendix G, parking.
Motorcycles.
And and
There.
and I would like to say that we'll probably, depending on how quickly we go through this, we may do public comment following this appendix. But if we go through it very quickly, we might have time to do another. So, all right, parking.
So parking is based on generally speaking, based on Lakeside, again, because it was the newest appendix. After discussion with the applicant, references to residential got removed. However, one thing was brought in from Raleigh, which was the parking district, which was, I think, Section 4. And the idea is that if they are interested in achieving the lower, there's a range of parking standards. If you want to go to the lower levels and also to be more efficient, shared parking throughout the district is necessary. That's how you achieve more efficient use of parking. So because we had worked on that a lot with Raleigh, we pulled that language from the Raleigh agreement into this development agreement.
So would that then take into account current Swedish property or just the donut hole space we're talking about?
No, the whole thing.
Right, yeah. And so I think I know the answer to this, but so in that case, is it ever revisited? We ever revisit what the Swedish parking requirements were? So in other words, the thing I've been concerned about with the Highlands in general is we say, we take one area and we say you have a minimum parking requirement and you can share it with other spaces, other streets or other neighborhoods, and then we take another one that's adjacent and we say you can share it with other spaces, but I feel like we're getting overlap or double counting the same spaces for two different agreements or two different
Projects?
projects. Thank
We
you.
actually look at that.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, we do. I mean, you're only allowed to take credit for the parking, for instance, on your side of the street, so that the person on the other side of the street has that available for them.
Okay.
So,
I assume, that's why I said I think I know
Right.
the answer to that. I think it's being handled. I just want to make sure we're not double counting the spaces for two different projects.
So, we do think about that in terms of on-street parking. We've been thinking about that relative to this development agreement. There's also a tool, which doesn't happen very often, called shared parking. That's on private property. And if Swedish, for instance, if the DevCo project and Swedish wanted to share parking and they can demonstrate that their parking has very minimal, their prime parking hours has minimal overlap, they could record a document that allows them to share parking. But that would be a pretty, that is a pretty overt action with review and certain criteria you have to meet to be able to do that.
Right.
So that's why it doesn't happen very often. Within the Swedish project itself, the goal is to sort of better use the parking that they have constructed.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example of DevCo. We're going to see DevCo, right, come
Yep.
to us, and I'll be thinking about that as well when that comes up, because that's a whole different type of project. It's going to have, pretty significant parking requirements, and I want to make sure we're not double counting those parking spots with this project. So, okay, thank you.
Chantal?
I guess my concern is always the other way, too much parking. In this case, you mentioned the floor to area ratio of 0.75. This is a pre-tall building, which leaves an awful lot of space for surface parking. Is there any other restrictions or anything that would at least build, I don't know, the several level parking or anything that would just not have a sea of parking as?
Well, I think there's some other, there's nothing that's a requirement. That hasn't been the approach that we've generally used to give some, because of the cost and the implications for structured parking. That said, I think that Swedish and the city think that if they're actually going to build what they want to build, that amount of square footage that they are purchasing, they will have to do some structured parking. They will not be able to build all of that office uses and fully park it using surface parking.
It doesn't seem like a good use of the land, but I mean, it still happens all the time. It's happening all over the valley floor and everywhere. So is there anything that can be put in there to address that?
So here's the example I'll give you. Before I answer that question, I'm going to give you one example. We had many years ago, it never reached the commission because they withdrew the permit, but Opus looked at taking the donut hole and building offices, and that was 2 levels of office building, I believe, over, they had parking on the ground floor, so no uses on the ground floor. The entire site was surface parking. So and that just met, the requirements. So I don't see how, if they're going to build all of that, they're going to be able to do it without doing structured parking. So
I think Lucy's message is it could be worse. But I think to answer your question, so there's guidelines in there. So there's guidelines that talk about edges and how you deal with parking lots, and so, but to be specific, it allows surface parking and it doesn't allow a ratio. So if you wanted to do something else, if you wanted to require or limit the amount of surface parking, you'd have to put a standard into the development agreement that did that. And to this point, and as Lucy mentioned, we have not gone there anywhere, I don't think, in the city. So it would definitely be a step out. And that's what you guys are here to talk about and think about.
So let me add 2 pieces, and then I'd like to hear if you have a suggestion. So one is that there is a community space expected with each building. So again, that would be pretty difficult to do with all surface parking. And second of all, and it is a guide.
Community space being what, open space?
Open space,
Okay.
plaza, I mean, there are a variety of ways they could achieve that. Also in the guidelines under parking, in the introduction, it says parking needs are accommodated and prioritized 3 ways. 1 is on-street parking, 2 is structured parking, 3 is surface parking. So, there is this expectation that surface parking, if all the parking was surface parking, that would be a point we would be in a position to have a discussion about.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if it's compromising everything else, all the other goals and standards.
And Lucy, I think in circulation, it's one of my favorite phrases you use, the sociable public realm. Would that sort of also give you a tool to manage how parking is done?
Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you have other tools or approaches you are suggesting.
I'm curious to see if anybody else shares that concern or would like to see anything in there.
I wouldn't. I think the restrictions in place are okay. I personally don't want to strive for less accessibility for our existing vehicle commuters in Issaquah. And I think the restrictions that are put in place with Central Issaquah Plan and here are pertinent, or excuse me, are strong enough to limit the type of development you may fear and that nobody really wants. So.
Yeah, I generally share your concern for if there's too much parking somewhere, too many surface lots and that sort of thing, like what we've seen in, parts of Issaquah from yesteryear and that are still in existence. I don't see that as an issue in the Highlands. I mean, it's quite the opposite problem. I'm very concerned about the shared parking in Grand Ridge Plaza right now. Most of the stores haven't opened up, and yet on peak times we're seeing very few parking spaces available. So I share your concern in general, but I don't think that's an issue here. I do have one question regarding, and maybe this goes in circulation, but I don't remember seeing anything, and maybe I just missed it. If there are shuttles or transit and so forth, is there anything that talks about locations where those, pick-up and drop-off points can be? Are there going to be any designated areas? Are there going to be load zones? I assume there will be load zones, but would those be shared with shuttles and taxis and those sorts of things? Obviously, taxi would probably be there, but I don't know to what degree if there ends up being a shuttle service or a bus service that goes up there. With all this parking that we put in on the street, and fire plugs and that sort of thing. Do we address that anywhere?
I need to go back and look. I don't know whether it's not a standard right now. There's a load zone standard, but that's probably intended more for service vehicles like FedEx or UPS or something like that. And I sort of think there might be something in the guidelines, but I have to go back and check. So
yeah, because I think of Proliance. They have a nice entrance for loading. I don't think that was a requirement, but that happened to be what they were doing. I'm assuming the facility or a set of facilities like this would like to have something similar potentially, but it would be nice if it was at least addressed in some way.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, and there's also, it's a great point, Jeff, and we need to figure out what to do with it because, even if, let's say we've talked about the mid-block crossing for pedestrians, and if that takes out some parking spaces because you're going to have some new bulb outs in that location, we need to remember that there may be some reasons to take out some of the parking. We talked about 8th last time. If you were going to have maybe a transit stop, that and we had already counted all the parking on 8th to make the minimum, then we'll lose some flexibility. And so we need to maybe think about that as we go through and count where the parking spaces are going to be here. There needs to be some extra, I guess is my point.
Right, exactly. And for assisted living facilities, ones that I visited recently, clearly there's a lot of transportation that occurs to get people shopping and that sort of thing. So I know that those facilities in and of themselves think about that and they try and build that in. But in some of these, if we're talking about these types of blocks and these types of buildings, maybe that becomes an issue. So, okay. Lina.
Observations. I do want to support what Chantal's saying about having a concern and wishing for structured parking. I also see how difficult and expensive it is, and just to further it, since we're still working on this document, whether there are any models for incentives that might help serve that and motivate towards structured parking. I don't have anything in idea right now. I'm just bringing that up as a way to approach it rather than requiring structured parking, finding a way to make it financially feasible.
So we did talk about that with Raleigh. One of the things, you probably won't like this, but I'll tell you anyway. The way the parking appendix is structured is there's a minimum and a maximum, and you cannot go over the maximum except if it's structured parking. And part of the reason that we did this as an incentive is sometimes it makes sense to front load a project with a structured parking facility that will then serve later phases. Because structured parking is more expensive and yet more efficient in terms of its footprint, it seemed that if they were willing to pay the price penalty to build structured parking, we would create that incentive.
Well, you're wrong, Lucy. I just love that. But and to your point, the other thing that you might look at, Chantal, I was looking at those numbers too, and the maximums help protect. They're not at all like the kind of parking requirements that laid the groundwork, so to speak, of the valley floor.
Mm-hmm.
Those were much higher per square footage parking requirements, right? Yeah. So we don't have that same challenge. So then the next topic under this subject of parking is with the parking district. Now, if I understand correctly, the parking district includes the existing Swedish property and this. And then, and I like the whole idea, when we have those parking districts and then parking is open, especially street parking, there aren't any restrictions. Anybody can park there, right? So I'm thinking ahead a little bit to a corporate campus to the north, a couple hundred apartments to the east, and a bus stop on Highlands or 9th, whatever it is right there, and some shopping right across the street. And so on behalf of the developer, when you put in a parking district like that, and it's limited, you don't have very much parking, but anybody can park there. It's shared parking, but it's only shared amongst themselves, right? Can they protect the parking for their own uses?
On their own private property, they can use the enforcement techniques that they can legally choose to do. On street, the city currently does not have parking enforcement staff. So so there's not a time limit, for instance, that might do that. And there may come a time when the city needs to make a different choice based on the impacts of not doing that. But the city hasn't made that choice at this time.
Yeah.
So if you choose to park at Swedish and walk to Safeway to get your groceries, I think we would applaud you for being very sustainable and park once mentality. They could tow you and you might find your car gone when you get back.
Yeah, that's something, we've been talking about a little bit, and I do love the idea of park once and walk, elsewhere, but and that's why I'm concerned if some have restrictions and others don't, it's going to be confusing to the parkers, if you will. Yes. And that was also why I brought up the idea of double counting those spaces.
And that's, I think, what inspired me, and what I'm thinking about is we want to build these transit-oriented residential developments, and perhaps, the DevCo apartments, we'd say, oh, well, we expect these people not to have as many cars, but then they all end up having 3 cars per unit, and they park out in the streets that are somebody else's shared parking. The other thing is during, well, we've seen many times in the Issaquah Highlands, people using street parking when the park and ride is full, because the regional area loves that park and ride, and there are not enough spaces. So I'm just thinking ahead about those challenges.
I'm glad I could be inspiring to you, but you're exactly right, and that's the stuff that concerns me. And I do want to clarify something something I said to Chantal earlier. I agree with your concern about too much surface parking, if not too much parking in general, but I love the idea of structured parking, and I too like the idea of that incentive. I actually think more parking is better as long as it's controlled and managed and set in a way that doesn't create a sea of parking. But structured to me is fantastic if we can make it happen. But I understand the limitations there. Okay, anything else on parking?
And just so for you guys, so there's a lot of tables in this appendix with a lot of land uses that are not going to be allowed. So I've got like strike-throughs through half mine. So when you guys, yeah, we're not going to, I don't see a wallpaper store happening on part of Swedish, or maybe a wholesale outlet probably isn't going to happen. So some of these things, again, we just incorporated the parking section from wherever we incorporated it from. So we'll go through and edit that so that the next one you get will be a lot shorter.
So, Lucy, I did find on page 20, 6.0 loading spaces and the purpose of required loading spaces. It does specifically refer to commercial unloading and unloading of commercial vehicles. That doesn't. It's not clear to me whether that means service vehicles or commercial vehicles for transit.
No, I think
So-
we have to go back and look at the transit piece, and it's an important. I mean, Swedish uses shuttles. There's the possibility that transit will come to serve this, and so it's definitely something we need to go back and look at specifically.
Right, and then there's the private services like dial-a-ride transit and access and that sort of thing. So, okay.
I was going
Go
to say,
for. Yes, Stephanie.
are there additional requirements when you have medical-type buildings for specialty parking, like an additional amount of like handicap parking or loading spaces for people, crutches and whatnot?
So handicapped parking is governed by building codes.
there's
It's
no
not
specific
in here.
facility? Okay.
Yeah, and it is very specific to the facility. And if you've ever been to Swedish, you will discover that like this entire parking lot, 2/3 of that parking lot is ADA parking or something like that. It's just
What are the
amazing.
requirements for loading zones, like for people, like outpatient areas with, small medical offices where they may have wheelchairs or crutches or whatnot?
Well,
Are
I mean,
those sorts of requirements?
Swedish is going to oversee that. I don't know that we're going to regulate that necessarily.
No requirement necessarily
Right,
for that?
right. And, for instance, at Swedish, there is that big kind of covered awning area that comes out here, and those are also loading and sometimes even valet, I think, to facilitate people who are arriving under the circumstances. So
Okay.
part of it is what we feel we need to regulate, and part of it is what we think they need to function. And, that's part of what we're discussing is how much are we regulating and how much are we leaving to their
We also
evolving.
have on the west side that big circle for that too.
That's right, Eric. There's another big awning that comes out on this side.
Right, so I
Eh.
think they obviously give ample consideration being a hospital now.
Okay.
Stephanie, on page 7, under general commercial uses, it does specifically call out the large health services, hospital, lab, facility, et cetera, with specific parking standards.
Small health services too, like if there's outpatient clinics and whatnot.
Okay, anything else on parking? I wanted to stick to my Vulcan mind meld with Mr. Kapler on the 8:40 public comment time, and I think we're right there, so.
So we can call parking complete?
At this point, yes.
Yeah,
I would say,
I won't take it away forever.
I would say, yeah, Scotch taped together, not stapled or glued. Okay? All right, so I'd like to, at this time, open up public comment. If you'd like to speak, please come to the microphone, state your name and address, and if you would, write your name down so that we have a record of it. You can do it after you speak, David, if you like. Thank you.
David Kapler, 255 Southeast Andrews Street. I thought you were going to stand up and applaud when she said that there was no parking enforcement in the city. Or acknowledgement of that, at least.
My car might still be there.
Not support of it, but acknowledge of it. If they sit long enough on a street around here, they'll eventually get to it. But back to land use. Allowed use is 3.2. Under K is kind of accessory uses, and there's corner store, 7-Eleven, whatever. I don't know. Jewelry store, variety store. What's a variety store? I don't know, but it seems like having dealt with the Highlands here for way before, when it was a dream rather than anything on paper, really. What was imagined and what ended up could be quite different. Conditions certainly have been found to be different. So what Swedish wants to do, what they end up financially having to do could be different. And I think how much of that accessory kinds of things are allowed needs to be a little better defined. There was mention of the Mountain Sound Greenway when the view as you're heading east is I guess we were sold that it was pretty much not going to be visible. The Highlands was not going to be that visible from the valley floor, but when Microsoft came along, we proved their campus up there because it was Microsoft. And then that never happened, but that would have been certainly fairly visible. Then West Highlands came along and you got a lot of visibility there. I guess the key would be getting back to the lighting issue on how the new buildings up there are lit or not lit would be an important part of the visibility, because nighttime visibility, I think, is more noticed than even the daytime visibility, because you do have, if it's daytime, you see a lot of other green. Circulation mix, there's going to be places where the bike commuters or the faster bikes are going to be going through this area, and there's going to be places where, wheelchairs and people working on the rehabilitation on crutches, wheelchairs, whatever, are going to be on the trails, hopefully. I've been spending a lot more time down here at the nursing home here on Front Street, which used to be basically kind of a pre-hospice kind of facility. Now it's gone into rehabilitation, and I'm certain, and there's an amazing number of people that work there, and it's a very busy place, and during the nicer weather, a lot of those people are younger, they want to get outside, and they are outside. So I think if we see the kind of a rehabilitation facility up there that's a residential one, I think it's going to be, definitely more rehabilitation than kind of a rest home, nursing home type facility. And so you've got some parking implications there, but you also got people that want to be out, and their visitors, their family will want to get outside too. So making sure we don't have those conflicts between the bikes that we want to encourage, we want people commuting on bikes, we want them to be out on bikes, but how we mix the faster bikes with pedestrians, especially the type of pedestrians we could have there is really important. It was great to hear Connie's points are valid, even if about SEPA. That was great. I was glad to hear that. Now we'll see how the checklist comes through. As of switching subjects here, just as informational, the plans for Bellevue College are on the web as of today, and a long narrative, 30-some, 40 pages of narrative about that. And it's going to be coming to you eventually, but it seems like it's real important to get the community aware of that, and that it's got, you see the plans, you'll see there's a lot of issues there with the circulation and the extent of what could happen over possibly decades, but eventually there's going to be significant amount. So there's a lot to think about there.
So Dave,
the community
Dave,
just needs to be aware.
That's a quasi-judicial,
Yes.
and they shouldn't be taking testimony on an application that they aren't
I'll
reviewing
try not
it.
to make testimony.
Because Bellevue College isn't here to talk about it.
Right.
So,
I'm just, okay.
so save it for another night. That would
Okay.
be good.
But I think just want to give it, but it's this on the web. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that would like to speak tonight? Last chance. Okay, seeing nobody, we'll close the public comment section at 8:45. All right. Good discussion tonight. Let's see, we got through G. We have 4 to 5 more to address initially, and then we can certainly go back and talk about any of the others. But I think we did a nice job of getting through them. Thank you. Good discussion. Do you want to make any final comments for this evening on this stuff?
So I will, of course, backtrack now. There are no parking enforcement officers, but the police force does enforce the parking rules.
Why does she look at me when she says that? Okay. All right.
Yeah, the vibe, the heat from across the street.
So anything else on this tonight before we move on to other business?
No, I mean, I think we finished those appendices.
Okay, great.
Okay.
I have, so the ones we have left are landscape, signs, lighting, and then there's sustainability and SEPA, which we don't have. Right?
Right.
Okay.
I imagine in the packet that you'll get the next time, I mean, we've been working on sustainability, so
Okay.
I imagine sustainability will be
Great.
there.
Great. So next meeting, which is going to be September 3rd, I think, we can have a good solid discussion on those 4 appendices. Meantime,
Hey, Jeff,
yes.
could I just ask that in terms of landscape signs and lighting, if there are any big comments, because we're trying to get another draft to you,
Oh, okay.
it would be good to know if there were big concerns or questions so that we could maybe have a draft that's a little bit closer.
Okay, so I'll ask if anybody knows of any big ones right now they want to throw out, please do. If not, I don't want to get into a deep discussion about those things, but if you don't have something that you want to address right now, go ahead and send it off to Lucy and/or Keith. Okay, you may.
Yeah, I tried to read through that in preparation tonight, but I just couldn't get through all of it. And what I was looking for are the kind of standards, and Mr. Kapler referred to them, that are full cutoff lights that have less of the lighting that isn't functionally required for safety, protecting the, what do we call it? Well, uplighting, to avoid uplighting, and just looking for those kind of standards that help.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I was just going to say, I share that. We're like in a bowl, and so, squawk, cougar, and are all seeing that. So as subdued as we can do it is a preference, I think.
I would say that, if there's any way we can have examples on slide, if you have slides with some of these examples. I know that we have some of it in here, but maybe we can put them up and talk about them if you have some of that.
And when you say examples, do you mean of what the fixture,
Yeah, like if we're talking about,
what does a full cutoff fixture look like? Okay.
Yeah, I know that we've looked at that before when
That's
we
fine.
were looking at Town Center years back and so
Okay,
forth.
and this is super helpful, and I just want you to note, I'm going to go back and look at this, but we started with the lakeside lighting, which we had worked with Denise Fong, and I asked her a lot of these questions about looking up to a hill, so but I appreciate, this is super helpful to get this ahead of time.
And the one thing that's different about the existing hospital is the ER kind of unloading area, which has a super lot of lights. So we can talk that through with Swedish and see if they anticipate any kind of similar lighting needs on the medical office building side.
Good to know.
Because that at least is protected by the trees. It's kind of at the south end, and I think the views of that area are pretty shielded.
Yeah.
But I think we were a little surprised at the amount of light that was necessary for that area.
And, because it basically has to be lit to OR standards in case they have to operate on someone coming out of an ambulance, which seems really important.
I wonder if some kind of shielding.
Well, that was what I was about to say, Eric, is exactly that we worked with them really closely in terms of having the canopy come down and solid walls come up as much as possible, and where the entrances and exits were versus where the residential views were going to be, to try and minimize that, just as you were saying.
I think.
And so my comment about lighting also carries through to signs. If there's any show and tell kind of stuff, when we talk about sort of scale or position, that sort of thing. I know we've talked a lot about that in the past.
Or pulsing,
What's that?
strobing, pulsing.
Yeah. We'll demonstrate all of those for you, Eric.
Is that desirable, Eric?
Yeah. We'll have strobe lights at the next meeting.
You don't mention it.
Okay. Anything else on any of that? Okay. So, open discussion. Any other topics anybody would like to bring up? All right. And Lucy, did you have an update on something else? You mentioned something. Oh. Okay.
I wasn't here for the round robin about how much we appreciate Swedish Hospital. I want to say it too. My family uses Swedish Hospital for wellness, and we were so grateful for the proactive environment there. Also, when I fell and hit my head last year, I was really grateful for the ER.
Ooh, that was, and that was
so
an awful
I just
call.
wanted to join in the accolades and thanks to Swedish.
Thank you. Lucy, did you have something you mentioned?
Yes, I'm looking for,
okay.
I'm going to it right now.
Nice work.
So the thing that came
Thank
up, let's see if I can do this. No, that's Copacabana, but anyway, That was a different discussion. So because of Jeff's comment about rooftops, I was just going to show you some images and talk you through a little bit of what's happened up there. So this is Regal. So all of this that you're seeing up here is screening of the rooftop equipment. This is Marshalls and Dick's, which Jeff expressed his admiration of. And
Let me be clear, I'm happy that they're there.
I know. The admiration of the
Pretty about that.
roof, let me be clear. This is not complete. So, you know, we'll see what happens. But the equipment is up there, the screening is not up there. So we don't really have the full picture. However, I do want you to know, well, let me go back one just for a second. So, you know, part of the thing about Marshalls and Dick's is that it is kind of right below the hill. And you can see that as, you know, for these buildings, which are Joseph A. Banks and Ulta, that it's just less visible because it's smaller and the building's more broken up. So, you know, it's partly just that particular building and that particular location makes it very visible. But, so this is Devco Phase 2, and this is what we call Block 23, which is right below parcels A1. And so first of all, they have this cool rooftop recreation area, which would make me want to live there. But the other thing that I noticed was the color of the roof. So there's building code requirements about it because it contributes to your energy load. And I went to the sustainability committee and the city staff sustainability committee, I don't think that's actually quite the right term, and was talking to them about the choice of white versus gray and how much influence we can have, and brought them pictures. So, I mean, there is an awareness that as a community with hills, people are going to be looking down on these roofs, and that it's not just a resource, but there's an aesthetic and a valid aesthetic thing, and how do we balance both of those needs, which are valid. So you started a good conversation. This is, by the way, it's called, I think, the Stairway to Heaven or Hell, depending on who you talk to. But this is the stairway that'll go from Regency all the way up to parcels A1. And then the other thing, and I'm going to put a picture in there because Swedish, this is their screening of their equipment, which I think is really handsome and blends into their building, and you don't look at it and say, that's screening, you know?
Right.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm actually very pleased with the Regal rooftop, with Swedish rooftop, and I saw that recreation area. Ursula and I were walking and saw that the other day and wanted to figure out how I could scale that building and go up and play up there.
You just have to rent an apartment
Apparently
for your
or befriend
business.
somebody, yeah. But I was really impressed with what I saw down there, and then you look at that, and then you look over, and even though it's not complete, I look at what it might look like when it's complete, and I'm thinking there's so much more we can be doing, and I feel that way about just the Grand Ridge Plaza anyway. With if we had some sort of a rooftop restaurant or bar or recreation area or whatever, it would be so cool, right?
So part of the reason that we have this slide is because there's a Brazilian landscape architect named Roberto Burle Marx, who I've never been there, but I've always really admired, that the way he designed all the sidewalks and stuff was as if you're in top of a building looking down on it. I mean, he was very conscious of that. And I was showing it to that group saying, you know, the question is, do we want rooftops to actually, and you know, how can we, in working with the energy code, be creative to have something on the roof, you know, that is not expensive but works with the materials that you're already having to put there, and that doesn't compromise the energy code. So that was the discussion that we had. We didn't reach any conclusions.
Well,
but
thank you for, I do really appreciate when we bring stuff up like this, you know, I mean, I will note that we probably know this, but the staff does a good job of following up on things, even though we might not see all that they're doing. I know that they're going, and I know you've had conversations about motorcycle parking. I happen to run into Craig Ramey and talk to him about it myself.
Good.
I don't know if anything came of it, but whatever. But I know that that stuff's happening, so I really do appreciate you, A, following up on it, and B, bringing it to us. So thank you.
I want to express that too, because seeing these results, I think, is very positive, and I think a lot of people benefit that live up there that don't necessarily know everything that's going on, but they can see the results and appreciate the results. So that's
Glad.
super good. Thank you.
All right, anything else from you? Anything else from the commission? All right, September 3rd is our next meeting. Thank you very much to all the Swedish folks, and we will see you in a couple weeks. Meeting adjourned, 8:56.